Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with story, we celebrate creativity, and my humble goal is to find interesting people, talk to them, and find out what makes them tick. I'm Sean Murphy. I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit. You can find out more about me, this podcast, and the things I do at seanmurphy.net. But today I'm extremely excited to talk with my friend Matt Davis, who is about to release a brand new book, which we are here to talk about. Matt is the author of When Things Get Dark, A Mongolian Winter's Tale, and his work has appeared among many places in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and like I said, many other places. He has been a fellow at the Black Mountain Institute at UNLV, a Fulbright fellow to Syria and Jordan. He holds an MFA in nonfiction from the University of Iowa and an MA in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He lives in Washington, D.C. for now, which we'll maybe talk about, with his wife, a diplomat, and their two young kids. Matt, it's always wonderful to have a chance to connect and chat with you about the different projects that we work on that are sometimes disparate, sometimes very similar, but we both have a passion for the written word, talking about it. But I've always been impressed by your intellectual integrity and acumen, and boy, does it come to bear in your book, A Biography of a Mountain. Welcome, and thanks for being here to talk about this.
Sean, it's great to talk to you about the book. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to have this opportunity. So thank you.
Well, I was telling you before we came on air, it's really been a joy to spend time with this book. I mean, it as we'll discuss, and as anyone that reads it will discover very quickly, there's so much in here. It's at once a very, it's a deceptively simple, like we're talking about a monument and a mountain. And of course, that is a door you open to get into all kinds of stuff about American history, the way story's written, the way narrative is framed, etc. And I hope I'll be able to articulate my own both appreciation and kind of awe of how you pull a lot of these threads together. So for a topic that again is seemingly simple and straightforward, it's actually very thorny and complex. And you manage to make that both, inspirationally educational, but very provocative. So I guess the big question that would be appropriate to start with is, how does one like yourself come up with a project like this, and when did you determine long form essay? No, this needs to be a book. Talk us through a little bit about how this came to be.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those kind words. Yeah. I mean, so the origin of this book sort of came on July 3rd, 2020, and that day, Donald Trump, who was president at the time, gave a speech at Mount Rushmore. He traveled there to celebrate Independence Day, and for the first time, fireworks going to be lit there for the first time in about a decade. And he, gave a speech there at Mount Rushmore, which, if you remember, I mean, it was only 5 years ago, but it seems like forever ago in many ways. I mean, the COVID pandemic was really just beginning in its initial months, and there was all kinds of stuff happening in the United States with regards to Black Lives Matter, the sort of reconsideration of American history and the monuments and memorials that are built to commemorate it. And so Trump went there and he gave this speech at Mount Rushmore that was, in my view, kind of a very narrow speech about American history and its sort of its path and the role of memorials and monuments in how you commemorate that American history. And I actually did not see the speech live. I was at that time, my second son was just a month old, and my wife and I were, had our hands full with a toddler and a baby. But when I was reading about it the next day, I began to sort of, think a little bit or ask questions about why Trump gave that speech at Mount Rushmore. And so, literally did a deep dive. And my agent was also very curious about why Trump gave a speech at Mount Rushmore in this capacity. And so, I began to sort of scratch the surface a little bit about why Trump spoke there. What was it about these four faces on the mountain that sort of framed his speech? And it just from that sort of simple question got into so much of what the book is about. These, how the Black Hills transferred from the Lakota Nation, the United States, why the memorial originated, how the meaning of the memorial sort of evolved over the course of its first century. And I think, what I ultimately learned, like with any, as a reader, I'm always fascinated by books that are about things you think you know, but that you don't really know much about. And this book was like that for me in terms of the writing. I had so much fun researching this book, reporting this book, sort of getting down deep into the archives and to the history books and to talking to people on the ground about, what exactly is this memorial and how does it represent the United States today? How has it represented it in the past, and how might it represent it in the future? So the origins really came from Trump's speech, and me sort of wanting to learn more about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's clear, in the early pages of the book when you kind of trace like this was the path I was on when I really started to go deep in the research. I think one of the things two things that kept occurring to me, one not particularly profound, but even talking about a place, wherever or whatever it is, ultimately we're talking about human beings. It's a story about people. And what I learned a lot about was how contextually crucial it was to understand the people that were there before the monument, during, and then ever since, and how the perspectives have shifted. But also Mount Rushmore, I think we would agree, and it doesn't matter if we agree, but I think one could probably take any number of monuments or institutions and say that's a metaphor for America. But it to me, it was very natural as kind of this leitmotif that it's one way of really getting inside of history, which is looking at something and understanding it's never a static interpretation of the motivation behind it, how it's understood, who tries to take advantage of that narrative. And I think it's clear. I mean, I know you, but even if I didn't know you, there's this genuine curiosity to understand human motivation. So it's a deeply, impressively researched book, but you were at great pains to talk to people and uncover the record of conversations that have occurred to really get a better sense and take us inside the minds of people who this edifice looms large in their lives.
Yeah, one of the things when I was a college student, I was a journalism student at the University of Missouri, and one day we had a speaker named William Lee Teet Moon, who's a great American writer, come and speak to us, and he, engaged in this thought exercise with us to sort of think about the land from a perspective of history and seeing what the land was like, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, a million years ago, and sort of think about it not just physically, but the people that are around there, the memories that are created in this space. And I
Yeah.
think that's always sort of stuck with me. And to bring it up to the present day, I mean, what happens so much with objects like Mount Rushmore or the Statue of Liberty or any number of different things you can sort of conjure up is that they have a way of evolving as the people in the land evolve, right? I mean, how we view it in 1925 when the mountain was first dedicated is very different than how we view it today. And that is a process of how the stories we tell ourselves, the memories that we create as a community. And that's really what interests me the most about this project is I wanted to do a history because I think the history is fascinating. But I also really wanted to pull it into the present day to sort of see how people on the ground in South Dakota are reacting to it today. And I one of the fascinating things about this is I'm not from South Dakota. I'm not Native American, but I found myself as an outsider being able to have conversations with people who are much more impacted by this memorial on a daily basis than I ever will be. And they really opened my eyes to a lot of different perspectives on it in ways that I'm just incredibly grateful for, but that I think also offered different perspectives for the memorial. Some that are very, if not pro Mount Rushmore, certainly celebrating what it represents, and others that are very much not so. And I think that for me is a sign of a complicated subject. You can sort of get at these different perspectives and try to figure out and tease out and understand why different people who are living in the same space just have a very different idea of what it represents.
Yeah, and the other thing, like I find this, I mean the research and all of the evidence is kind of unassailable, but I feel there's a very human impulse depending on the historian. You clearly have a very real interest in telling as truthful a story that honors these different perspectives. I think that sets a higher bar for the writer that you clear to your credit. But I we were talking before we came on. I just traveled up the coast, and as you get into near the coast of Massachusetts, it's no matter where you are on the political spectrum, no matter what school you did or didn't go to, unless you're literally ignorant, you're seeing some of the names of towns, and it's just a very welcome or very necessary reminder. Seeing a place like Sippawisset, et cetera, you realize this country was here and inhabited many years before the Pilgrims came. I think one of the services your book does is ground this particular narrative necessarily morally in the history. So maybe talk a little bit about how that was maybe your gateway into telling the story. I feel like there was this very purposeful endeavor to carve out space before we even get to the action and say, let's understand what this place has been, how it came to be, and how it became, which is such a story in world history, a real point of contention for different cultures.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the cover of the book, and one of the things I wanted to do with this was to decentralize the actual sculpture. I think when people think about Mount Rushmore, they think about the four faces, and we can get in maybe later on to the artwork and just what the sculptor Gutzon Borglum was creating and how we created it. But
Yeah.
I wanted to emphasize that the mountain itself, and as an extension, the Black Hills of South Dakota, and the Black Hills of South Dakota are such an amazing place. They're not, I mean, millions of people go there to visit Mount Rushmore and many of the other national parks that are in the state, but it's still sort of under the radar. I mean, it's not as, I was just in Boulder, Colorado, for example, this past weekend for a wedding. And, it's very highly touristy. There's lots of people that go there to hike, camp, ski. There's lots of microbrews, all this stuff. In Rapid City, the Black Hills are not that built up, and it's kind of in that sense like a very local place with a very distinctive and very rich history. It's physically beautiful, but I think what attracted me to sort of focusing on the history of that space was that in so many ways it kind of captures a lot of the myths and stories we tell ourselves about the United States.
Yes.
Our engagement with Native communities, our westward push as pioneers in service of a manifest destiny, our search for gold and what that means, the way that our military has really shaped the landscape of the United States from its inception, east to west. And I think so much of that history, so many of those myths are found in the Black Hills, as are a lot of the contemporary questions that we're asking ourselves about the United States. What parts of our past should we focus on? Should we focus on the parts that are, wonderful and just have championed individual liberty and rights? Should we focus on the parts of our country that are really problematic in terms of, how our westward expansion killed off millions of Native peoples? And what is the place of the hills in this conversation? And what is the place of this sculpture in this conversation? That's what attracted me to the history about this. And I really didn't, when I first started to research this, I could see these larger sort of threads coming through, but it was only really when I began to sort of dig in deeper. And my book is the product of so many other wonderful writers and scholars who have written about this region and about the people in this region before I started. And so so it was a lot of fun to read all these books and sort of get a sense of the history and learn
Yeah.
more about it. But really, what I said, as I said before, what attracted me to the story was the contemporary aspect of it, in terms of how Rushmore itself fits into these larger conversations we're having as a country. How do you memorialize American history? What narratives do we tell? these are big questions that we are really wrestling with as we enter into our 250th birthday.
Yeah, and I mean, I honestly don't think any intelligent person reading this book would sniff out any opportunism. I mean, certainly we have the big anniversary coming up, but it couldn't be more relevant in terms of a talking point, not to mention like the intellectual and all these other academic implications, but wrestling with this idea of America itself is an idea and has been shifting. To me, one of the and you address this, but one of the implied questions, I think for the non-curious, rhetorical question for anyone that's like, oh, America used to be much more uncomplicated and make America great again. What was it about 1925 that there was the impetus to memorialize these particular presidents and make this statement? That opens up all kinds of follow-up questions, but I think that in and itself is a statement that there wasn't this fixed identity or there wasn't this narrative that was so universally accepted and embraced that it was unambiguous. I think there's always been this ambiguity, and then that gets into kind of cliche territory, which is nevertheless true of who owns the narratives. The prevailing powers tend, who writes history is the victor. All of that stuff comes into play. Um, to make a question out of this and tie my other question in, and you feel free to comment on that. But for me, having a passable understanding of American history and feeling like not only did I know Custer's story and what that kind of represented at that time, you do some heavy lifting to really contextualize not just his life and his final stand, and how that impacted that area. But again, for lack of a better cliche, how that itself is a metaphor for conflicts before, after, and even outside of America. You want to talk a little bit about how the looming and very complex mythology around Custer?
Sure. I mean, Custer is fascinating. Custer is probably one of the most, he's very popularly biographized, if I may make up a word. But he's, like uh, Custer is a fascinating character because he died young. He died at 34, and because of that, he sort of died in media res, right? Like he did not go through the downhill slope of aging or any of that stuff. And the way that he died at the time, I mean, if people, um, you know, Custer is important to the story for two important reasons. The first is he led the expedition through the Black Hills that found gold. And before that time, there was, it was in treaties and in laws that Americans could not travel to the Black Hills unless they were affiliated with a governmental entity, like a military expedition. Even that was controversial. So when Custer walked through the Black Hills with his Seventh Cavalry and they found gold, that opened the floodgates to many other, Americans wanting to come into the Black Hills to try to find gold. And Ulysses S. Grant, who was a president at the time, he tried his best to prevent Americans from coming in. But at a certain point, he was just like, I can't stop this tide anymore. People can come in. And what you found, even before Custer died in 1876, was you got a ton of miners that came in, and you're beginning to sort of see these settlements appear in the Black Hills. I mean, some of which have become iconic. I mean, Deadwood and Lead, these towns that have become HBO shows, and just sort of really fixate in our imagination as to what the Wild West frontier was all about. And then Custer, just in 1876, then he led troops against a large contingent of Native Americans, predominantly Lakota, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, which the natives called the Battle of Greasy Grass. And his Seventh Cavalry got wiped out, and he was himself killed at the end of June 1876, right before the centennial of the United States, when people were gathering in Philadelphia to celebrate the 100th anniversary of our country. And when word trickled out from the West that Custer had been killed, the Seventh Cavalry had been slaughtered, it just really framed him as this sort of Christian martyr that died at the hands of these, savages, and just what we needed to do as a country to get our revenge against this death. And what we did is we broke treaties and seized the land that Lakota had been given and the treaty that was signed just in 1868. And from that moment, the United States took over the Black Hills and that led directly to the creation of Mount Rushmore in 1925. I mean, the hills in South Dakota, more properly, given the trajectory of how things were going in the 1870s and 1880s, would definitely have been American territory at some point. There's very little question, I think, about that. But the way that the way that it happened, the way through Custer's death that it happened, I think just sort of adds to this larger myth of the Black Hills and of Custer. Yeah, and I think you know his legacy still plays heavily on the American imagination, right? I mean, there are many towns, including in South Dakota, that are named after Custer. His reputation has taken a great hit in contemporary scholarship because of his personality, because of some of the military missteps he took that led to his demise, but certainly the ideas that he embodied and sort of the contradictions that he embodied have become sort of this larger than life figure that maybe his accomplishments might not let him to normally receive.
Yeah, and I think, again, just speaking for myself as a, non-historian, but fan of history, fan of story, fan of reading, your research and any of this type of research proves that to understand history, you start picking up proverbial rocks and looking under, and it's unavoidable. So, for instance, I think, again, speaking of wherever one is educationally, politically, my generation, our generation and older, there was the cowboy Indian myth, and there was this sense of, yeah, it was a little bit of an overreach, and there was some violence, but we civilized the land. And it's when you do this type of reading, it's impossible to not get a better understanding of the fact that this was very gradual. There's a lot of treachery, and there was a tremendous resistance to what we mythologize as this inevitable westward expansion. That is not to turn the conversation into, an interrogation of colonialism, but it suffices, I think, to say that it is complicated, and anyone politically or academically that wants to shut down those types of conversations, so be it. But it can be said that you're not truly trying to understand history as it actually happened, which doesn't have an agenda. Understanding the stories of how we got where we got, what can we learn from that? What can we glean from mistakes and triumphs? The real stories are there, and they have to be told, which is the work of writers and historians and researchers to uncover those.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think you're also, I mean, I think it's complicated today because I think you do have certain ideas of floating around about or competing ideas about what is American history and what sort of narratives should you tell and how are they appropriate and why are they appropriate. And I think for the context of this story, again, like what has always interested me in this story is how the past influences the present and how the present influences the past. And as I get on later in the book and move from Custer and move even from the origins of Mount Rushmore and get into some of the Trump speech in 2020 and some of the the implications of this for us in the contemporary world, like that past is not just past; it's deeply present in people's lives. It's deeply present in how they view the land that they're living on and how they view their family's stories. And I think that's true regardless of where you are in the United States. I mean, the United States is such a young country. And I think we forget about that sometimes. My kids go to school here in Washington D.C. and we have friends who are from other parts of the world, and some of them are European. And we were talking once at a soccer game or something, and I was telling them what I'm working on, and this Italian friend of ours like, this part about the United States really makes me laugh. I'll go to a place and they'll say a historic town from 1850, and I'm like, a historic town, like. So I think our perceptions of time and sort of what it is like is they're skewed. But what that means, I think, really directly is that like we're only a few generations past from these events, right? And so like I think the fact that it is past and it doesn't form our mythologies, but it's also very relevant into how people are living their lives today. in really direct ways. And that's what really interested me as a writer in writing this book. I'm not a trained historian, right? I'm a writer. I'm a journalist. I can go through an archive like the best of them, but like I'm not technically trained in this. And what so for me, what the act of sort of writing or creating this book has been in being able to draw those kinds of connections. And that really came through in the people that I met in South Dakota, which I really enjoyed spending time with and still in touch with, and just have learned a lot from their perspectives and how they view the land that has been impacted by Custer, impacted by U.S. policy, impacted, by many of the different tragedies, quite frankly, that the U.S. government has enacted on Native peoples in this specific region. Right? You're talking about boarding schools. You're talking about Wounded Knee. You're talking about Little Bighorn. You're talking about, a lot of you're talking about placing Native American communities on reservations that were not properly supported by the federal government, and all that stuff. It's history, but again, it's a direct link to how people are living today and how people feel about Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills today. And you can't break that linkage. I mean, that's just that to me is it's that's when you're being dishonest.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think, yeah, that gets into both, literally and figuratively the human aspects of any story. I'm curious, you kind of bring that up and you're kind of on the ground, encounters. What are some things, without giving away, because everyone has to read this book to understand, but what are some things, just for instance, that you learned or found illuminating, that by talking to people in that area, that you couldn't or wouldn't have gotten from even the most exhaustive research?
That's a great question, Sean, and I think honestly, it's more of a general sense of the ties that people have to the land. Um, whether they're Lakota, whether they're descendant of pioneers that came across the country and settled in the Black Hills, there's a real attachment to the land. And I don't even want to use the word ownership. That's not what it is. It's attachment. It's that my family has lived in this space for over 100 years, and that means a great deal to me and my identity. And that's something that for myself I do not have. Right, like my parents were born in New York City. They moved to Chicago. I moved to DC. I'm not really rooted anywhere. I'm from Chicago, but like I'm not going to sort of claim that's been the home of my family for generations, right? So, but being there and talking to people whose, in some cases, families have lived there beyond their family memory, right? Like I think like that's when you really get a sense as to what this place means to people, and that's what I learned the most from being there is just that really close tie to land that people there have. Not everybody, of course. I mean, some people are transplants, and some people, have only lived there for 10 years or whatnot. But for people that have lived there for generations, that is definitely the sense that I got.
Yeah, and you bring up two really important factors, which are, anyone that's traveled to Europe or around the world, it should be humbling to walk beside a cathedral and see it still erect, still new looking, and realize that was constructed before, centuries before the Declaration of Independence. That should be sufficiently kind of awe-inspiring and humbling. But you also mentioned, again, I both kind of facetiously but genuinely, writers want to avoid cliches, but you're talking also about the attachment that anyone has to any area worldwide and even within America. But now we're getting into the proverbial flyover, but I think it's a very important distinction to make note of, because I think that contributes to some of the understandable and exploited tension in American politics. These places whose stories are very important and very meaningful for obvious reasons to the people that live there, that are kind of like, yeah, Western expansion. And, then we got to California, and that's where, the gold rush and all the good stuff happened. Like we got from here to there. So I can even appreciate reading a book like this and having this conversation. I won't say resentment, but it's understandable why people feel their stories aren't being told or understood, or even something as simple as a real attachment to place. because those of us that
Yeah.
grew up on the East Coast, right? Those of us that are on the coasts, have traveled more, don't have roots. So there's a lot of layers of disconnection that I think if those were bridged would maybe yield better conversations and better understanding.
Well, I'm going to push back a little bit. I don't think there's reason. I never met anyone in South Dakota that was resentful that their stories weren't told. I mean, that's not what I mean by that. I mean, I think people have. I think there's people that I met for the most part, were proud of their family stories, and didn't really quite care what people from the coast had to think about it or say about it, whether they were being adequately or accurately informed. I mean, I think that you know, but I think it's important. Your point is that there is how you build community and how you sort of build um, memory from these communities are extremely important. And I saw this in particular, and one of the chapters in the book that is more contemporary than is historical talks about the Rapid City Indian boarding school and how, you know, there is a direct example of how the idea of land, the physical space of land, impacts memory, economy, politics, history, all that sort of wrapped into one. In ways that I think sometimes get overlooked in smaller communities. I mean, I think it's when you're dealing with bigger cities, there's so much going on that there's maybe not just one or two factors that sort of impact what's happening. But in smaller towns like Rapid City that have not that long of histories, right? We're talking about 150 years. Um, it's these things have sort of ripples of magnitude, and Mount Rushmore is one of those things, right? I mean, the story of Mount Rushmore and why it was created and how it was created, and how it's impacted South Dakota, Western South Dakota in particular, is monumental. It's really, pardon the pun, but it's really important, right? I mean, so we talked about how the United States over took the land from the Lakota Nation in 1877. So you have dozens of years where South Dakota is beginning to become a state, and it's finding its way. It's agricultural. It's really pretty much farm based, especially in both the East and the West. Um, and there's a surge in commodities prices in World War I when the European agricultural markets tank, and so South Dakota becomes wealthy. It becomes there's this. It's called the South Dakota boom, where you see this huge influx of people coming in. The economy is going like gangbusters. The prices for commodities are increasing. Things are going really well. And then in the early 1920s, when Europe gets back on its feet after World War I, and its agriculture recovers, people don't need South Dakota commodities anymore, and the markets shrink and they tank. Banks close. Excuse me. Farms foreclose. And so what you have is this one singular guy named Doan Robinson, who's a state historian of South Dakota, who's involved in many different aspects of the state. And he is very interested in trying to diversify the state's economy from agriculture to something else. And he decides that something else is going to be tourism. And so his idea is to build sculptures in the Black Hills that these burgeoning car tourists can come and visit this memorial or visit these sculptures and add to the economy, right? And so just that very idea changes the way that we all perceive of South Dakota today, right? So from that moment when Doan Robinson had this idea to when he hired Gunther Borglum to completely change that idea into something else, I mean, without those steps, the way that we view South Dakota today would be entirely different.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue to this fascinating character because there is a person or a figure that looms large in the history of the construction and execution of the monument, which is Gutzon Borglum. Talk a little bit about this. Speaking of complicated, interesting people.
Yeah, he is complicated and very interesting. I mean, so Borglum, he's just fascinating on so many levels. Even his birth story is just incredibly fascinating. I mean, he was born in what is now Idaho, to Mormon immigrants from Denmark, and his father married polygamously two sisters, and his Borglum's mother was the younger of the two sisters. And as Borglum's father began to look for work with his growing family, instead of moving west, he actually began to move east, where the railroad was already laid, but there were more towns that were being built along that railroad. So the more they moved east, the more illegal it became for their familial relationship, from their familiar arrangement. They could not have polygamy. They could not have engage in sort of the kinds of family structures that were allowed in Mormon territory. And so eventually, Borglum's dad he decides to go to medical school in St. Louis, and he gets accepted. And at that point, he makes a decision. He's like, we cannot live with two wives, five kids, one husband. And so they ask Borglum's mom to leave the family. And Gunson Borglum is, I think, 4 or 5 years old. He's a toddler. And he says goodbye to his mom for the rest of his life. And, I'm the father of two young boys, 7 and 5, and I can only imagine as I see them daily wrestling with their appreciation and understanding of life, what that was like for young Gunson Borglum. So he's, motherless in the sort of middle American West. They eventually settle in Omaha, or just outside of Omaha, and he's exposed to all of these different aspects of what we consider American mythology. Cattle drives. He's meeting with different Native Americans. He's seeing pioneers, criminals, lawlessness. He doesn't really have much formalized schooling. He's sort of learning how to do art on his own, and from this soil develops this amazing talented artist who eventually finds his way to Los Angeles, serendipitously meets um, this benefactress who encourages him to go to Europe, which he does. And he's a young man. He's learning all this stuff, and he's beginning to sort of come to his own as an artist. And when he goes to Europe, he dismisses painting in favor of sculpture because he sort of falls in love with the work of Auguste Rodin. And he comes back to the United States in 1901, and he sort of thinks to himself, what this new country needs is a new form of art. And he begins to want to create these monumental sculptures that he thinks sort of portrays this new country in his own grandiose vision, his own ideas of what America can be. And Borglum's, his talent is undeniable. He's a really, really talented artist. His politics are very swerving and very, very complicated. In many ways, at the early part of his life, like he's someone who champions the little man, right? He's against corporations. He's against government interference. He's against he's for these individual farmers and people who just want to make a living for themselves. And then he finds himself in Atlanta in the mid 1910s, working and being the first sculptor for the Stone Mountain Memorial in just outside of Atlanta, which is, of course, a memorial to the Confederacy. And while he's there, is at the time when the Ku Klux Klan is being reborn. And he falls into a lot of really important relationships with Klan leadership. A lot of his personal beliefs mirror the Klan's beliefs. He's virulently anti-immigrant. He's virulently anti-Semitic. He's racist. And he begins to sort of work with the Klan to build this homage to the Confederacy. And as he does so, he finds himself really embroiled in the sort of like the interpolitics of the Ku Klux Klan, which in the 1920s is just really wild. I mean, people forget there's a couple of great books out there about that period in American history. But the Klan was kind of mainstream. I mean, like there were senators, there were Supreme Court justices, there were lots of governors and House of Representatives figures and political leaders who were part of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was so in that sense, Borglum wasn't too far out of the realm of the mainstream at the time. But I mean, at the same time, I mean, much of what he was doing from our perspective today is just is terrible. And so he's working with Stone Mountain, and this is so hard to believe from our vantage point of today, or maybe it's not given our current state of affairs. But the United States Congress is getting ready to pass a bill that will mint a coin to honor the Confederacy. This is less than a century after we just fought the Confederacy. And the money from that coin is going to go to Stone Mountain to support its carving. And the Ku Klux Klan leadership of the Stone Mountain Memorial Association sort of say, hey, Goodson, let's do this. Let's get all this money we're going to get, okay? And we'll give you, X hundreds of thousands of dollars. We'll keep the rest, and we won't do the sculpture as we talked about. We'll just sort of do a small little sculpture, and we'll get all these millions of dollars. And Gunnson Borglum is like, no, that's not what I signed up for. I want to sort of carve this memorial. I want to do this work. And they have a huge fight and they fire him. And so this is in early 1925. At this point, Gunnson Borglum has already signed on to carve Mount Rushmore, but he hasn't started. And so at this period, as Mount Rushmore is about to get started, he's just been fired from Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial. And he knows he's 58 at the time, 57, 58. He's sort of like, he's got maybe one more big project in him. And he knows that he cannot fail in what he is considering his Northern Memorial. He needs to make Mount Rushmore something that not only will succeed, but that will transcend what people think about when they think about memorials, especially memorials carved into granite mountains.
Yeah, and I mean, so that again, that in and of itself is several movies worth of intrigue and again, kind of these interstices of even within American history, even within people that viewed things a similar way, there's financial, political, cultural, time-related complications that it's never a straight line, and perhaps certain narratives that begin a certain way end up in a radically different place. You allude to it, and again, no need to linger on it, but I couldn't not notice and pay attention to the fact that in addition to the stuff we've talked about, certainly around 5 years ago in 2020, we were revisiting, or in some cases, maybe visiting the notion of Confederate statues and the KKK. And again, unpacking, I was astonished at how many people didn't understand that those didn't just spring up as these innocent tributes to fallen, soldiers. The timing of those monuments was unmistakable and was greenlit and enthusiastically embraced by a very KKK adjacent contingency. So when we're
Well, they
talking
weren't they
about
weren't even adjacent. They were the KKK, right? And it was that's who got Stone Mountain started. I mean, and a lot of the Confederate memorials across the South were organized by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which had a very distinct perspective on what they wanted to accomplish with these sculptures. And my book doesn't really go into that a whole lot, but I think what's important for the story of Rushmore is that Gunnson Borglum had deep affiliations with the Ku Klux Klan, and it's something he was. I can never find anything that sort of said that he took an oath or he donned a robe or anything like that, but that he introduced leadership to national politicians. He seems to have been part of some sort of like Klan Concilium, which was a national policy organization, and he brought that with him to Mount Rushmore. Now, he never. There's not a whole lot I found that he was completely engaged with the KKK when he was constructing Mount Rushmore. But certainly, his ideas, his politics, were present with him when he was carving Mount Rushmore, and it's something we talked earlier about. What kinds of stories get told, what kind of histories get told, and that Mount Rushmore does a pretty thorough audio tour of the memorial and sort of touches on different aspects of it, including the biography of Gunnson Borglum. And never is it mentioned that he was, affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan. And I just think it's so fascinating that this central memorial that is, an homage to American political democracy in many ways, was built by someone with close ties to the KKK. I mean, I just don't like it's kind of too on the nose. If it wasn't true, you'd be loath to make it up in some ways.
right.
And I think that you know who Borglum was as a personality also deeply impacted the way that Rushmore was built. I mean, he was an egoist. He was very talented, but he was very hard to get along with. It was his way or the highway. When things went well, he took credit for all the great work. When things went sideways, he blamed other people. And I think that's not unusual for great artists. Sometimes great artists are not the best of people to work with, right? And I think that's true with Borglum in many ways. And but I think that like and I sort of write about this a little bit towards the end of the book, but I do there is some things I do greatly admire about the man, and there are other things that are just incredibly problematic and complicated about him, and I just really do think that his own complexity sort of matches so many of our own flaws as a country, where it's maybe it's appropriate that the person who carved Mount Rushmore is as complicated as Gunther Borglum.
Yeah, and I mean everything we're talking about now, Matt, is again one of the many reasons that I found your book so fascinating and recommend it so enthusiastically. It's we also are in an era where we're wrestling with art monsters and this idea of what do we do when people who create great work aren't the people we hope they are? And I always kind of err on the side, maybe as a writer, of feeling like to a very large degree it's immaterial. The work has to account for itself. And if we want our artists, whether they're sculptors or novelists, to be great people, I think it says something about us and on our childish aspirations, as opposed to being able to objectively look at the messiness of how art and history is made. But feel free to comment on that. But I think what I would love to ask, based on everything that you just said, do you have within the book or your own kind of what you've gleaned? How did he view the achievement then, and how would he view how it's received now? And maybe talk a little bit about, either him personally or a little teaser for those that are about to read the book, the shifting perceptions and getting into the idea of intent versus execution versus reception. Because, as we know, just as writers, what you intend to do not only might not achieve or end up there, but how it's received is also valid. So even if you say, I meant something completely different with that story, someone receives it a different way and it makes them think of something else. That's also part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think at the time that he died, so Gunther Borglum died in 1941 in March, and at that point, the memorial was unfinished in terms of what he envisioned, and it was only construction only lasted for another 6 months or so before it ran out of money and stopped. And so the memorial is in many ways unfinished. And I think so Borglum would have seen it as something that was indeed unfinished. I mean, the biggest thing that he would see unfinished is he wanted to tell a broader story of the United States by putting in documents related to its founding, by literally creating a hall of records where there would be these smaller busts of American figures that did impact American history over the course of generations. So he, from that perspective, would think about it as a little bit, it's not done yet. Move it to the present day. I mean, if you think a little bit about um, what the original purpose of the memorial was for Doane Robinson, which was to generate income through tourism dollars, I mean, it's been exceeded the wildest expectations, right? From Gunther Borglum's perspective, I think he would really appreciate and sort of bask in the glory of not just the money that's been made from his creation, but the way that Mount Rushmore has become so iconic. I mean, it's in our passports, right? It's something that's very recognizable to Americans and to foreigners alike. It's something that over the course of time has come to represent American freedom. And I think its complications today is something that I don't. I think he would appreciate. He loved a good argument. He would argue, with the best of them about what Mount Rushmore means. I think honestly, what he would probably have the hardest time with is the way that Mount Rushmore is so easily memeified, right? It's just like you can, in sort of in that sense, kind of taken down pegs from its like lofty perches, right? I get, I still have Google alerts from Mount Rushmore, and the vast majority of the information I'm getting from these Google alerts are not about happenings on Mount Rushmore, but who's the Mount Rushmore of LSU basketball players, and who's the Mount Rushmore of jazz musicians, like who's the Mount Rushmore of Philly cheesesteaks, right? So like I think in that sense, we already have kind of like taken this idea and put it up there, but then also kind of denigrated it in our own ways. And he probably would not be too cool with that. But I do think that his initial vision of Mount Rushmore as representing empire, American exceptionalism, manifest destiny, excellence is something that you can very easily, draw a line to how the MAGA movement, the conservative movement, has sort of seized on and used Mount Rushmore in their own sort of, historical, political, and cultural narratives. And I do think that Borglum would be more aligned with that perspective than potentially the other more sort of looking at it more complicatedly or problematically.
Yeah, awesome. So I mentioned my personal inability to not make connections because they're obvious between KKK, the Confederate statues, and Rushmore, et cetera. But getting into a more contemporary framework, I'm old enough to remember a very concerted and, as it turns out, extremely successful attempt to immortalize Reagan, even while he was still alive. And I had an early appreciation of how these energies, these political energies, um, speak very much to contemporary culture, who's got power and influence. But there's this notion of politicians in particular are not necessarily welcome to rest on their laurels or their record. It's up to their biggest fans to create or augment these myths. So thinking about the Mount Rushmore monument to Confederate to Reagan, Reagan Airport, to thinking about Trump speaking there and whether they're kidding or not, we need to put Trump on Mount Rushmore or add him to Mount Rushmore. It's kind of bringing us full circle. Does that open up a possibility for you to talk a little bit about what should we be talking about or what could we be talking about to understand ourselves, America, how history is made, and so on through the lens of Mount Rushmore as both a static and evolving, kind of monument?
Yeah, and that's really the question, right? And I think from the perspective of Trump, there's obviously been legislation introduced to include him on Mount Rushmore. There's no physical space for him; they'd have to redo the memorial, and so that's kind of a mute point unless there's drastic changes to the memorial, to the sculpture itself. I think that the larger question you're asking though is really key, and I'm never going to tell people how to think about something, and I think it's there in the course of doing this project, I've had many people from all different perspectives and walks of life say things such as why are you focusing on Mount Rushmore? That's such like a stupid, idiotic, like cliche thing to you know why are you what do you have against Mount Rushmore? It's like the most amazing, beautiful sculpture to American democracy. And I, so if you take, then you have a lot of other people that are very offended by Mount Rushmore and its existence in the Black Hills, right? And so there's all these different kinds of perspectives on it. And I, my evolving sort of perspective on it is really that, you know, it exists. It's there. It does represent something to many different people. And if it's going to exist, if it's going to be there, why not have it be something that can reflect a bit of our complicated historical narratives, the way that we can both celebrate what is great about this country, which there's a lot great about it,
Yep.
and also understand that there's a lot of things that are problematic with this country, not the least of which is that we have built in homage to this country, to our westward expansion, in lands that were seized illegally by the United States, in lands where really tragic things happened to communities, Lakota Nation in particular. I mean, that in and of itself is just it's just very, very complicated. And I do think that if the memorial is going to have sort of a place that's not just for one aspect of the country or one part of the country, that really needs to embrace that complexity. And there are definitely people that have worked at Rushmore and been living in Rushmore shadow that see that is possible. But I think for a lot of other Americans, that kind of nuance, that kind of complexity is right now just really hard to sort of embrace.
Indeed, and I think it's fair to say it always has been to a certain extent, but now kind of the bifurcation of ideology is so polar and pronounced that it it's more stark. But my kind of I guess optimistic, very genuine take is whether we're talking about Rushmore or any monument or really any story. I feel like the goal of the writer or the project is to stimulate conversation and discussion, hopefully productive. So again, when I say that there's a many layers and levels that I appreciate your book on, it's that it's a gateway to discussion and better understanding not only our history or how it's made, but how different people react to it. Because any story breaks into a million other stories. So I guess for me, it's just endlessly fascinating and informative to understand the country better and our history, but understand the lives and the people that you talk to and are showing, as opposed to just telling how they're impacted, how their ancestors were impacted. All of this to me is a positive thing because it's a desire and it's a curiosity for knowledge. Sharing that doesn't mean, and I'm speaking for myself, not you and your intent, but not converting anyone, not telling anyone how to feel about a certain thing. It's just maybe not being comfortable having a prescribed opinion and never looking past that. And I think that's at the heart of the whole kind of assault on academia right now in the humanities is we just want to have discussions and learn more. And how can that be a bad thing?
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean that's sort of what I hope to do with this is just to get people to think a little bit about what think about the biography of Mount Rushmore. Think about it from its its origins, its influences, what it means, its future. That's really what I want people to sort of think about.
Yeah. So and you've got the you're kind of in the pre-rush. It's so funny, right? Because knowing you, I've seen you through the process when you first told me you were working on this project to you were done with the project to the project's coming out. It's always interesting on this podcast to talk to writers when they're at different stages. You're in this hopefully mostly, if not entirely positive build up. You should be very proud. You should be very excited, but you're in the vortex right now. What are you really looking forward to? Just getting out there and talking about it and reading from it?
Yeah, I am. I'm excited about that. It's, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I'm excited to talk to people like you. I'm excited to talk to, do different events and talk to people, in different places. I'm excited to go back to South Dakota. I mean, I have a couple of events lined up there, in November after the book comes out. And, that's really where, people have strong feelings about, Mount Rushmore. So I'm eager to have those kinds of conversations with people. Yeah, like I do. It's funny. I've been one of the things that's happened just in the different stages that you described is when I started this project, I really, in some ways, thought that I was writing a book about the past, right? But because of the way that the United States has gone the past several years, it's become so much more of a book about the present. And unfortunately, with what we're seeing in the past few weeks, with regard, I mean, with the murder of Charlie Kirk and sort of the conversations over free speech, sort of who gets to say what they want to say. I'm worried that it's a little bit of a book about the future in terms of where can nuance go, where can complexity go if we're all sort of allowed or not allowed to say certain things. I mean, what does that mean for our future conversations? And so for me, the book has started as one thing, become another, and may yet become another thing in the future. But I do hope that like what this can do is just as I mentioned before, spark interest, spark conversation, get people thinking a little bit about not just Rushmore, but sort of this larger questions of how do we memorialize American history? How do we view its narratives? Especially since we as a country and as a culture are going to be bombarded by this stuff leading into July 4th, 2026, when we do celebrate the 250th, which I'm sure Rushmore is going to be a huge part of that. I think they're already planning gigantic firework displays, and we'll just sort of see what else they have planned for the memorial. But I hope that you know the the nuance and the complication that I bring to the book is something that we can talk a little bit about as a country.
For sure. And I think you deserve a lot of credit for like I've hopefully adequately articulated, like opening up the pathway to have productive and interesting discussions. But um, I think again the larger the issue is you can't read a book like this and feel like I mean it's funny because there's a dichotomy. You've done your work here and it's done thoroughly and convincingly. But I think the real success is that someone can't read a book like this and feel like now I know all I need to know. It in a way is a provocation to read more and understand more connections. And I think that ultimately is at the heart of what any good story does that's well told, is it's an invitation for further thought, further reflection, and perhaps beliefs that can either be challenged or improved or changed. So in closing, what I want to acknowledge, Matt, is congratulations and my genuine gratitude for writing a really compelling, piece of research and work, but also I won't say reawakening, but instigating a curiosity and a desire to better understand where I come from.
That's great. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate that.
Well, listen, it's been great having you. All the best. I'm gonna look forward to you out on the road and high-fiving you from afar. And we'll make sure that we provide plenty of links to your schedule so people can take part and celebrate, and mostly go out and buy their copy of Biography of a Mountain. Matt, all the best. Congrats again. It's always great to spend time with you, and we'll see you again at some point soon.
Sounds perfect. Thanks, Sean. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everybody, we'll see you next time. Check us out online, Some Things Considered. You can also check out more at seanmurphy.net. Stay safe and keep reading. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.